the Reluctant Christian Feminist podcast and YouTube channel. I'm here with my friends Laura and Jenni, and we're going to talk about what church policies can prevent abuse. And this is a topic that they're pretty familiar with. So why don't I bring them on? And Laura, you want to start by introducing yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Kate. It is a really fun to be here with you today. My name is Laura, and I work as a abuse recovery coach and policy consultant with Safer Coaching and Consulting Services. And so I have had a 20-year career in legislative policy and advocacy, and I'm a survivor of a few things myself, and have turned all of these passions into helping other survivors navigate and recover from abuse. So that's my background.
Thank you, Laura. Jenni?
Yeah. My name is Jenni. And again, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having us, Kate. I love the title of your podcast as well. I am an educator and domestic violence advocate, and I am a domestic violence survivor. And I'm just so grateful that Laura and we've been friends since college. And as we've come through our tough life experiences, we started Safer Coaching and Consulting Services as a way to fill in some gaps, things, especially in the church, of how we felt there were these missing pieces, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
And so that's what we're doing. And besides that, I'm a solo mom to two amazing kiddos, and Laura has an amazing kiddo too. But we're just really happy to be here.
Awesome. So how did you guys get involved with each other and involved in talking about like church policy?
Sure. So like Jenni said, we met in college about 20 some years ago. I'm not going to date us. I'm not going to date us too much there, but we met in college, and we've been really good friends ever since. And like Jenni alluded to, we both have been through some really hard things in our personal lives. And then, and as a result of that, we sought out some professional training. I'm a professionally trained life coach with in different modalities, Jenni in domestic violence advocacy and different things as an educator. And one day we were just talking, and we thought, do we need to start a business? And so here we are. We felt like this is an area it's a personal area for us. And it's also an area of passion, something that we see great need in for openness and honesty. And people are willing to delve into this really complicated topic in honesty and just in all of its messiness.
Yeah. And honestly, you can't, once you see the problems of abuse in the church, you can't unsee it. So that was my thing. Like once I was walking through it and saw the horrible response that I received, and then started seeing how other survivors and victims were being treated, I had to do something. It just isn't in my personality to just sit back and let those sorts of things to go on unchecked.
Yeah, I would agree with that too, Jenni. In my personal life, a passion of mine has been to just to sit with the vulnerable. And abuse victims, survivors are really vulnerable, and a lot of times abuse is due to misuse of power dynamics, and that's a big part of what we're here to talk about today. Is the power dynamics that we see in these abusive relationships, where a person in a position of power or people, and then this victim survivor who is abused and often mistreated as a result of that. And so those are the things that I can't unsee either, and it is a foundational principle for me, a value in my life, that I have to take a stand now with the survivors and support them in whatever way that I can, and whatever way that with the resources that I have available for me at the time.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really awesome that you guys both work with victims, but you also have a lot to say about policies that can help prevent abuse. And I know that's one of the reasons that we're here to talk, like what are the policies that churches can use that help prevent abuse? And then how do those policies like help leaders use power in ways that are responsible? So let's start with what is the purpose of power? So what is the purpose of power and influence in leadership?
That's such a great question. And I mean, if we're going to use the scripture, the Bible, as our foundation, Jesus was about servant leadership, right? He tells us that we are not supposed to be like, the other leaders in the world where we're lording it over people. Leadership is about coming alongside people and meeting their needs, and not not about hoarding power for yourself so that you are the one making all of the decisions. And I think so many churches unfortunately have lost sight of that. Now, I mean, there's some great ones. I'm not, we're not knocking everybody, but that's what power is supposed to be for. It's supposed to be used to lift up the vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd agree. Brene Brown has a great example of that too, when she talks about power over as opposed to power with and power to. And I think Jesus is a great example of the power with and the power to the vulnerable, rather than power over. Like, we're not here to have power over people and to control people and to manipulate people to doing what makes us look good in that instance. And so the power that I have now, I choose to use to stand with the vulnerable and sit with them in their pain. And that's what we are, that we're calling our churches to. And we think that, I had kind of a shower thought this morning as I was thinking about this podcast, and so many of our organizations and our religious organizations are really concerned with maintaining the organization, maintaining the institution, instead of caring for the individuals within. And if we look at a scriptural model, the church is not the institution. It's not the building. It's not the structure. It is the people. It's the sheep. And if we continue to build policies and procedures that maintain the legal, we're keeping our structure, our organization legally safe or legally whatever, and our sheep are bleeding and dying, what does that accomplish? And so I'm always coming back with questions about, where are the survivors in this process? Where are they? Are they still a part of this community? Do they feel safe in this community? If not, then there's more work to do.
Now, when you think about like policies that help prevent abuse, and then when you're talking about like the leaders who may abuse, a lot of those policies are enforced by leadership and by those in power. So how does that dynamic work, where the person who's in charge of the policy is often the person that the policy is designed to restrict?
Yeah, I mean, that's where the danger comes in, and if the church is open to changing, right? If their pastor, if their leadership board, if their elders are open to making changes, then it's great for them to hire people like us, or to get a grassroots movement coming in where people are getting more education and understanding that how prevalent abuse is. First of all, like, the numbers are somewhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 women are affected by abuse. And that number does not change for the women sitting in the pews of our churches.
No.
So, you're looking at your church of 100 people and 4 women. That means 4 families, right, are being affected by abuse at any given time. And so there was a study done too that most 75% of leaders underestimate the amount of abuse and violence that is happening within their own communities. And so they aren't aware. And so if you bring awareness, then you have to notice, how do they respond? Because you know what? It's also a little bit about like throwing your pearls before swine, like Jesus talked about. If you bring it and they're open, then you can move forward together, right? But if you bring it and they're not open, then it might be time to move on, right? Like, where are you going to invest your time and your safety for your own soul and your family's care to a church that is not willing to develop these kinds of policies?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that accountability is so important. I don't want to, belabor the point, but those accountability structures are really, really, really vital in making sure that leaders are keeping themselves accountable, and that there is some sort of, that we don't have one leader with some unilateral authority. I'm not make a dictatorship analogy there, but also, like, there needs to be accountability that leaders are regularly involved in, and checking their own spirit, their own selves, in how they're engaging with people, and their openness and their honesty, and they're willing to receive correction and guidance and on all of these things.
Yeah, thank you for that. So what does unaddressed abuse in the church What is that costing us?
That is so hard to quantify. It is costing, ultimately, it is costing lives. There are people who are dying, who are being killed, who are committing suicide, who are extremely traumatized, who are leaving the faith. We all know, Jenni and I both know people who are entire families that have been faithful in serving their churches for 20 plus years that are no longer, that won't set foot in a church right now because of the abuse. So you're losing people, and the church is losing, all of that, all of the things that Jesus talks about in caring for the sheep become somehow invalidated. And that feels really, really wrong to me. It just really doesn't sit right with me at all to see what I see is as wolves being protected by these leadership structures. Like we're bending over backwards to protect the institution and the perpetrator, and then the victims and the survivors are left feeling abandoned. They end up leaving the church and the church community. They find, they may go to a different church, they may not. They may end up leaving the faith as well. I think there's, I don't know how you put a dollar sign or quantify any of that. There's therapy bills, there's all kinds of things that you could probably try to quantify it, but it's really difficult.
Yeah, I was thinking specifically about more of the qualitative costs, like the ones you were mentioning.
Yeah.
Like it's costing us our mission, and it's costing us our credibility. It's costing us lives.
Absolutely. Because when churches put the institution above all else, a lot of times their reasoning is we can't hurt the cause of Christ. Well, let me tell you, I don't know any unbelievers who think, hey, they're really good at harboring abusers and child molesters. That makes me want to know Jesus, right?
Yeah.
It's counterproductive. And so when they're saying like, Jesus doesn't want us to, Jesus doesn't need us to protect his name, his reputation, right? He is perfectly capable of doing that on his own. What we need to do as believers and followers is to be honest and transparent and protect the vulnerable instead of the perpetrators. I mean, Laura especially has been working recently with a church that is not following even its own procedures and buckling down and, not releasing the name of the perpetrator and all these things. And we're just like, who are you trying to protect?
Yeah.
Right. It's not the people. It's not the people.
I agree. I feel like we're losing the moral high ground at this issue.
Absolutely. 100%. Well, and honestly, and I don't know how deep we want to go into theology, but this is the Reluctant Christian Feminist podcast. But the reality is that complementarian theology, the theology that believes in hierarchy, that men are above women, either in the home and in the church, or one or the other, that
some
theology,
sort of male headship. Yeah.
Right. That theology is harmful. It causes harm. And the people that I know who practice it, they're not bad people. They're not bad Christians. It works for them, but they don't really realize that they're not taking it to its logical conclusion, right? But when it's a breeding ground. It's a breeding ground for entitlement, which is a huge part of power, right? If you're going to break down the abuser, you have to get to the heart of abuse is about power. Abuse is about feeling entitled to that power. So if your church is teaching men inherently that they are better than women, are all men going to abuse? Absolutely not. No, but a lot of them are. Right? The statistics say 93% of sex offenders consider themselves religious, which is super dangerous because they also tend then to have more victims and younger victims because too of the church's emphasis on forgiveness, right? And misusing that. So, there's just so many different directions you can go in because it's a hot mess right now, honestly.
It is. And can I share a story for a minute? This was a little while ago, about 10 years ago. There's a big church that had an incident with a pastor who was caught in a what was, in an affair, which I would say is in an abusive situation with somebody that was under his authority. And the church took immediate decisive action and fired the pastor and set him on, kind of removed him from the church community. And people were like, yeah, that is the right thing to do. That is great. I'm glad that they took that decisive action in that case. 18 months later, this pastor, they brought him on stage and they did this open forgiveness where they said he has followed all of the things that we have asked him to do. We're embracing him back into community. They didn't rehire him, but they embraced him back into community after 18 months. And I was a part of that congregation that stood and applauded this at the time. And looking back on that, and I'm thinking, wow, 18 months is really not a very long time for the damage that was likely caused. And I went back and I looked up a news article from the time and the story from the family. This is the story from the family, and I'm just going to read it because it basically says the family no longer attends a church of any faith because they no longer trust people who claim to do God's work. And so I read that and I think that was a major failure. If the main focus was restoring this leader and the family.
Mission accomplished.
Okay, they did that. They accomplished that. However, this family is no longer a part of the community. And if we are fostering communities that focused on the perpetrators, on sin management, on forgiveness, on restoration of the perpetrators. Not that any of those things are bad, but the survivor needs to be protected. The survivor's safety needs to be taken as first priority among any policies that we see in any procedures. These things we can say that we yes, it's very important to us and we took decisive action. Those are all good things. Not quibbling about that. But the fact that this family is no longer in the faith at all is really, really troubling to me.
Yeah, and you said something very interesting, and it is something that I had to grow away. I shouldn't say grow away from, but I grew up hearing about these pastors who'd have affairs, and have recently quit saying the word affairs because
Exactly.
I believe that it is abuse of their position. Can you go into a little bit of that? Because it does feel like it's marketed as an affair. And I feel like that's a very damaging term to use.
Well, it goes into the power and control issues, right?
Right.
So just like a therapist, it is illegal for a therapist to have a sexual relationship with a client because even if they're consenting adults, it's understood that relationship inherently has a power structure, right? The therapist is the one with the knowledge and the client is the one with an issue. The same is true in churches, right? Mm-hmm. The pastor inherently has more power than the congregant. And when there is a differentiation in power, consent is not possible, right? So it might not be technically illegal because clergy sexual abuse has not been made legal in all states, although there are some great groups out there working on making that illegal. It definitely is immoral, and it just makes it so much easier to shove under the rug if you make it an affair, a sin issue. Oh, but the grace of God, go I, right? All those platitudes, instead of acknowledging that the Bible calls spiritual leaders to a higher standard. And you're not even going to hold yourself to the same standard that the world holds to counselors with their clients, doctors with their clients, university professors with their students, right? It's just another one of those things where there is that differentiation in power that makes it not an affair inherent.
Yes. And those words are so important, Kate. I'm glad that you picked that. You picked that out. Like those words that we use are so important. Like when you call something an affair, that assumes that both parties are on equal footing, that they both have the ability to consent in the same way to this engagement. And that is absolutely not the case. It makes it very tricky in navigating, if there is a congregant that is under the leadership of a pastor or a leader of any kind, it makes it really, really problematic.
And I think in addition to what you guys have said, and it was really good, but when you call it an affair, you're placing blame on the woman as well in these cases. And in these cases, they're
Exactly.
all male pastors with females. I think that's what we're thinking of. So you're
Yeah.
placing blame on the victim, and you're not recognizing that this person was victimized, not that they got
Right.
caught up in an affair.
Yeah,
Exactly.
That's exactly
Right.
one of the other consequences of this, is that there is that victim blaming that goes along with it. That it's like, yes, she has the equal responsibility in this case, and yes, she may have consented, but in a sense of like, yeah, she willingly supposedly participated, but it's not this at the same level. You cannot equate the two when there is a power dynamic like that.
Yeah. And as happens in a lot of churches that I was raised, not raised in, but churches that I used to go to when I was young. The church I was raised in was awesome, so I don't want to throw them under the bus. They were really great. But as happens so often is when you say that they're caught up in an affair, the woman is often portrayed as a temptress. And that is a very common old Christian way of looking at women, all the way back to Eve. Women are to blame for all of the sin and the difficulties in the world. So an affair comes up, it's like, oh, she tempted him into sin and tripped him up. And so restoration is about, really, like you said, let's restore this leader because he's charismatic. He teaches the Bible so well. He cares about people. If it wasn't for her, he would be in a really good place, but she just messed up this whole marriage that he had and his family. And so I think that's one of the reasons also why I'm not into affair, calling it an affair anymore.
Right.
And furthermore, based on that whole power dynamic, if you are complementarian, can a woman give consent if she's not an equal partner?
That is a great, I think you bring up an excellent point, an excellent question around that. And I think in a lot of the complementarian teaching also, there is this teaching that men really can't control themselves around women. And that's also problematic to say, okay, so if they really can't control themselves, then it is her fault somehow that he fell into this thing. And again, so we're blaming the victim. Fell. He just fell. He just happened to trip and fall. It's like this whole narrative around a perpetrator protection centered process. And it's the more that I see of it, the more I'm like, I cannot stay silent about this. And we need to do better in the church.
Absolutely.
I was just going to say that's why the Desmond Tutu quote is a huge driver for me. And I never say it exactly right, but when people keep falling in the river, yes, we pull them out. And Laura and I do some of that work, right? Of coaching survivors and walking with them through their healing process. But at some point you have to go further upriver and figure out why everybody keeps falling in. And so that's where the policy and the procedures come in, right? And we've really found that in churches there has to be a twofold approach, and both of them are multi-step, right? This is not an easy thing, but you do have to focus on prevention, but then you also have to focus on the response, because that's part of the reason why sex offenders feel so safe in so many churches, is because the perpetrators are not dealt with in a serious manner, right? It's almost like they know they can get away with it. So churches, in their policies, they have to have a two-pronged approach: prevention and proper response, with the victim-centered focus instead of a perpetrator institution protection policy.
Absolutely. I hear the whole innocent until proven guilty. And you cannot take that approach in these situations. That is a court of law proceedings. But when you are dealing with abuse and survivor and victim protection, innocent until proven guilty just doesn't work.
Even in our court system, presumed innocence may often involve jail time. So
exactly,
that's an excellent point. There's so much broken in the justice system too.
Exactly. Well,
it's so difficult.
I just think that that phrase has been so absorbed into our culture, like that we have to, and it fits so well with Christian forgiveness and reconciliation, the warped view of it, that we have to believe they're innocent unless we have this incontrovertible proof. Well, I'm sorry, I'm not going to put my child with someone who has suspected an accusation of abuse against them until we finish the process or
Mhm.
however long that. No, we don't do that in real life. And so yeah, it has to be about accountability right now and safety right now. And also there's this myth of false reporting that says, well, they might be lying, right? And the statistics are 2% of reports are false. And so you have to start at the baseline of believing the victim, because the chances, like, yes, you can look into it, and if it is one of that 2%, then that's a whole nother story, and we do need to work hard to restore the reputation of that person. But the chances are that it's true, and also that the victim is only giving you the smallest part of the story. They need to see if they can trust you with it first. So if they come to you with information and you don't, and the church does not respond well, then you're probably not even getting the whole story, because they realize that it's not safe and they're just going to shut themselves off again, where they can be protected from more traumatization.
In addition to only 2% of the charges being false, I think the other number that's kind of surprising is the huge number of unreported cases that
Exactly.
happen where people don't report it, or maybe they don't even recognize it. Have you run into this where people were abused or groomed and didn't recognize it?
Yes. I mean, I will say that I have personal experience with that. I was sexually assaulted as a teenager, and I'm only recently, like, it took me almost 30 years to figure out that that was what that was. It wasn't in a church setting. It was with a young man who claimed to be Christian, but it's like, that's a whole different story. But yeah, I would say that is very normal, especially for those of us who have grown up in, like, I was trained to be a sweet, submissive, like unassuming young woman, be kind, be sweet, and so all of those things come together, in a complementarian system where men have some sense of authority, even if it's not like overtly said that, yeah, they're better than you, but they are still, you're still supposed to submit to the leadership that's there. And yeah, so it does happen. It happens quite a bit, and that's part of the whole grooming process, is that the victim doesn't realize what's happening, because they're kind of being, not to say, I don't know if brainwashed is the right term, but that's what is happening. They're being formed into what this person wants them to be, to serve the person's needs. And so I think that is a very, very normal, typical thing that we see.
And I see that a lot for victims of domestic violence. Because, first of all, when I say domestic violence, I kind of say domestic violence and domestic abuse interchangeably, because violence to me is not just physical, right?
Mhm.
When I say domestic violence, that includes emotional abuse, financial abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, coercive control. It's a really broad picture. So women coming out of domestic violence, especially from complementarian churches, myself included, I did not know I was being abused. I thought I had a hard marriage, right? And it took years for me to realize how he was systematically tearing down my self-worth and my mental capacity and my ability to make choices for my own life before I could finally get out. Right. And he did not need to use very much physical violence to do that to me. And it's not really even until you get out. It's so hard because it takes so long to realize that, yes, it is abuse. Right. And then once you get out, you, like, it's almost like this brain fog lifts. And then it takes years to realize, oh my gosh, that is what was happening to me. That was what they were doing. And so that's part of our, when we work with churches, part of our prevention policy is talking more about what abuse is, right? Stop
Mhm.
just talking about how marriage is permanent, because that is not what the Bible teaches. Start having sermons where you actually talk about what abuse is and make sure that you're ready to support victims when they come forward. Because I was gaslit my entire until I finally got out what marriage should be, what marriage is, what abuse is, and what it's not. And that's something like less over 2/3 of pastors don't ever preach on abuse, ever. And the ones that do often end up preaching from the pulpit something that's actually more harmful than helpful.
And that's tragic to me. And that shows that there is a huge need for training and for humility as we approach this issue in our pastors and leaders, that they, they're really not equipped. Seminaries don't equip pastors in this topic. And so there's a huge need for training. There's a huge need for awareness. And yeah, so I think that's really hard when they don't ever talk about it. 2/3 of pastors don't ever talk about it, and 1/3 of their women, likely women, or and a percentage of their men as well, are survivors and are dealing with this.
I feel a little surprised by your suggestion that they actually preach about it from the pulpit, because I have been to church all of my life, and I can't ever recall a sermon. I think I saw one sermon on abuse, and it was by Craig Rochelle, and it was online. I think that's the only time I've ever seen anybody preach on abuse. And I do think that it isn't something that a lot of people might even recognize. Like, they hear about abuse, but they may think, well, that will never happen to me. That would never happen to anybody I love. That will never happen to anybody around me, or it couldn't happen in this church. And the truth is that churches are seen as great places for predators to go. And so, like, what are some of the policies that a church can put in place to prevent abuse within that church, and then to help people who may be dealing with it, whether in the church or maybe even outside the church? Like, maybe the person got abused at school, or they had a previous marriage. So
Yeah, I think that, prevention, it needs to start early. It needs to start with our kids and talking with little kids about consent and honoring their yeses and nos, even in things like tickling. I mean, like, if you're tickling a child and the kid says no, 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 and you keep going, like, you're not honoring that child's no, or the consent for a hug. Like, I've really tried to anymore say, like, may I hug you, to my daughter's friends or whatever, that I know that are probably fine with me hugging them, but that's important to me. And anytime I touch somebody I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, I touched you without your consent. So those kinds of things are just super important to start instilling as early and as often as possible. Also, something like teaching our kids that when somebody picks on you, that's not a sign of affection. That's an abusive thing. That is not like, oh, he has a crush on you. No, we need to change the language around those kinds of things. And so these are some of the things that we can start talking with little kids about, even before we get into, like, what is abuse and what does it look like. Start training them to trust their own instincts. When something feels uncomfortable, let me know. We'll figure it out. Even when you're taking your kid to the doctor, like, if you're not okay with this procedure, we're going to find a way where you feel safe to go through this. Like, we're not going to hold you down and force you to go through this. Like, there are all of these things where we need to work with our kids from an early age to start fostering these environments where they are valued, where they learn to trust their instincts, where they can ask questions and be open and honest about those sorts of things. So that's where I think, like, that's where it needs to start. And even if as we're building these policies, like training our Sunday school teachers and some of these things, all of that is really important.
yeah.
And then, so when you keep going through that, so like Laura was saying, is really, really important. Like, we don't want to train. I know I was trained to believe that actually abusive behavior is love. Oh, they're just showing you affection, right?
Right.
And we're teaching kids to not trust their instincts. At my past church, the pastor, I swear, his favorite saying was, "The heart is deceitful above all things. Who can know it?" Right? And we are training, especially girls, and that's on. I mean, the statistics are out there. We're especially training girls to not trust their guts, to say that all emotions are bad, instead of realizing that emotions were given to us by God to be our spidey sense, to be our way of knowing when something's wrong. And just remembering that we don't have to be kind. Well, we don't have to be nice. We don't have to
Right.
be nice to someone who's making us uncomfortable, right? Our safety is number one. So as the kids grow and we're teaching them these things, and they're learning to trust their own instincts, then as they get into the teenage years, where youth group, since purity culture, like talking about sex is like the favorite youth group topic, right? But let's instead focus on what makes a good relationship. What are things that are red flags that we should be running from? How do we become a dateable person, right? Instead of holding up, again, because of these hierarchies, girls, especially strong girls, think that they have to find some man who can lead them. And so they end up, only person stronger than them is an abuser, right? And
Mhm.
abusers are skilled at hiding their abuse until their victim is within their grasp. And so that's something that Laura and I love doing, is leading those sorts of workshops and things about red flags in dating and building positive relationships. Because honestly, so much of the prevention really, really starts with the children and the youth.
Part of that too is the, examining of power dynamics and hierarchies within like these review processes that churches can go through in order to examine their own way that they view leadership and power. They can start building into some of these things, that they have ongoing training for ministry and staff leaders on domestic violence response, warning signs of abuse, coercive control tactics, this whole the whole spectrum of abuse when it comes to the different types of abuse that are out there, as well as our body's responses to trauma. Like even the Trump hearing recently, like the woman was questioned as to why didn't you scream, why didn't you run, why didn't you fight back, all of these things that are like, that's her body's trauma response. And people need to be aware of how our bodies and our nervous systems respond when there's a threat. And sometimes that is a freeze, a shutdown, a fawning response, even where you're like bending over backwards to please this person so they don't kill you or harm you. So all of these things can be built in to help prevent abuse.
Yeah. I really like what you're talking about with restoring victims, and I would say preventing victims. And yet the church is really about restoring sinners too. So what is your take on, if somebody is an abuser, has been an abuser, and they really are seeking true repentance? And I'm not saying putting it into a leadership, but where does the church have a place for somebody like that?
I think that's a really tricky spot, because we are, as Christians, so often so focused on forgiveness and restoration. I think the apostle, I'm going to take it back to the apostle Paul and he was killing Christians. He was part of killing. That's pretty abusive. I don't know how much worse you get than that, but that's pretty bad. And after his conversion, it wasn't like an immediate switch where he went back and was starting to be a pastor in Jerusalem where he was killing people. He went away for about 17 years before he ever went back to Jerusalem. And even then he, like the scripture talks about, and then when I went to Jerusalem, I only met with so-and-so and such about this stuff. And so I think that gives us one example of a ways that if we're prioritizing the survivor, does the survivors feel safe having that person in community with them? And if the answer is no, then that person needs to not be in the community. And that may sound harsh, but there are lots of other churches, there are lots of other places that people can go. And I for one am like, if there's a survivor, we need to make sure that survivor feels safe. and cared for and not re-traumatized by the faith community. That doesn't mean we don't forgive. We can forgive that person. We can say that they are, that they're restored, but that, you're not allowed to worship here because you did a lot of damage. And we wish you well on your way. That's my response.
One of our clients at a church nearby to me, her abuser, she was able to get a protective order against him, right? And so they have to like exchange their kids at a neutral location. But somehow we find out, this is a larger church, that this perpetrator who has a protective order against him is on the safety team at this large church. And when that information is brought to the leadership saying, whoa, why is this guy on the safety team? He has a protective order against him. Like, he is not somebody who should be in this position. And to see the church hem and haw and worry about that guy's comfort and ability to worship God over the panic attack that it's causing the survivor, and then the survivor not feeling safe to go there to that church anymore.
Mention the potential harm that they are putting the whole congregation in by placing this person in a position of authority or leader, in a position where he has some role and responsibility to play on a safety team.
Yes. And this particular perpetrator has even gone on into the court system and testified that the reason why his ex-wife isn't going to church anymore is because people have found out who she is, when in reality, it's because she is not safe at her own church. Right. And so I would be very careful to say, like, there are other churches they can go worship at, because I don't want to pass them along. That's the SBC's mode.
No, I don't want to advocate for that either.
Right.
But.
Right. But if somebody feels that strongly for these people, because honestly, the statistics show that 1 in 10 abusers will make a long-term change. Okay. 90% of abusers are not going to change. Okay.
Right.
So we need to err on the side of the victim, of the survivor. And, if somebody is feeling extra worried about this guy who's on the safety team and not being able to go to church anymore, well, why don't you have a Bible study with him, right? Somewhere offsite, but the safety of the people needs to be more important than anything else, honestly.
Yeah, I agree.
Can you give me an idea of what you two do when you're going to look at a church to examine and maybe do an audit, or to see what changes they could make?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have what we're calling a survivor lens tool that we offer for free for churches, that just gives, it's kind of a series of questions that churches can use when they're pulling together communications materials, sermons, that sort of thing, to say, kind of like loan you like the survivor's glasses for a little while. It's like, can you look through their lenses for a minute and see how is this landing with likely 33% of the women and a large percentage of folks in your congregation. And so that's something that we offer free of charge right now. We can come in and do some workshops. We do trainings with staff, and we can offer some of those things as well. As coaches, we often lean into like values, like, what do you really value? What do you want to get out of this process? And work from there to find what we can do. There's, again, this is a multifaceted issue that may create multifaceted responses with different types of organizations. So we are limited in what we can do, but we can definitely help people get the ball rolling and take a look at some of their policies and be like, here's some gaps, here are some things that you may need to really like invest in moving forward if you're really serious about keeping your people safe.
Right. And the idea of the freebie is for some self-reflection, right? And then as you start to notice the gaps, then to realize, okay, this is the training that we need, right? This is what we're missing. I know personally, like as a survivor, most messages on forgiveness are extremely triggering. I feel like they have no nuance whatsoever of what trauma survivors have experienced, as if forgiving is the easiest thing in the world to do. And
It's magic.
if you, it's like this magic wand. So we can definitely do a deep dive in, we're biblical. Again, nowhere in the Bible does it say that because you forgive someone, then that means that they are allowed to continue to harm you. Right. And so we love going through those. Once you realize, okay, we have some holes here, then we can come in and we can read through the policies if there are any. If there aren't, we would love to help develop those, starting, like we said, from children's ministry on up, and to even like start going through like some of their past sermons that are like posted online, and like kind of do a feedback process on that. Like, you see how this needs a little bit more nuance here, right? And just to get that training, because I don't think anybody, for the most part, they're not going out there trying to harm people. They just honestly don't know. And that's a lot of the problems too at mega churches that I've found, is that the teaching pastors are so far removed from the actual congregants, right? They have the other pastors on staff are the ones that are meeting people on a daily basis who are struggling and going through these things. And I just know at churches where I've been at, like the teaching pastor is like, oh no, you can't divorce for any reason. None at all. Right. Whereas the marriage and family pastor is actually like, you don't see the trap, the living hell, the soul sucking marriages that these women are in. And you cannot tell me that that's okay by Jesus, right? Jesus does not value institutions above people, right? He said the Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath, right? It's the same idea. Like, instead of making an idol out of marriage or restoration or reconciliation, we need to be focusing on the individuals, and especially paying attention to the power dynamics, because a lot of times it can come down to a he said, she said situation. And most churches are like, oh, we don't know, we can't say, right? But you have to be trained to look for the difference in power, right? Somebody is getting something out of this. And when you figure that out, then you can figure out who the abuser is.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite things that makes me cringe in sermons a lot of times is like, the Bible is clear about fill in the blank. And I'm like, is it really that clear? Like, can you find one interpretation of this particular passage? And I think that those of us who have survived some sort of trauma or spiritual abuse in these settings, like, scriptures have often been used to manipulate, to abuse, to do things that are like really not godly towards people. And so when I hear that in a sermon, I'm like, oh, that really could be a harmful phrase. And so many pastors, I'm sure they're not like, they don't see that. And it's not like, it's not malicious on their part. They're genuine, many people that are just genuinely doing the best that they can and want to serve and love people. And there are little things like that can be tweaked, that can just be like, let's make it a little bit more survivor friendly in what we're talking about here.
Yeah. In an earlier episode, I talk about different reasons why the Bible can be difficult to understand. And it comes down to culture and bias and language. And there's one other reason, but unless we truly understand everything, scripture itself can be difficult to understand. And of course, my favorite person in the Bible of all time, without any sort of, I think we would all agree, my favorite person is Jesus. And I think the gospel message is clear. Like, we may not understand a particular scripture, but we understand that Jesus came to save us from our sins. We understand that, accepting Jesus as Lord and Savior is our path to total restoration with God. So I think those parts of the message are clear. But in one part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is talking about forgiveness. And he says, if your brother has anything against you, leave your gift at the altar and go to your brother in private and, make sure things are right between you. That's a paraphrase. And that I've heard often being given as the formula per se, the formula for how to
Yeah.
forgive somebody. But I think that that could be very difficult if you have somebody who's been abusing you. Going to them
Yes.
on your own is
Believe-
not a good idea. There is
Right.
the power differential. The assumption in that particular
Mhm.
verse is that it's you and your brother equals, not
Exactly.
you and your abuser. So
Yeah.
Right.
yes, I've definitely seen scripture abused, and I've seen, it isn't clear. Anybody who says it's clear is gaslighting you, probably. I
Yeah.
think what is
You
clear is
can,
that Jesus loves you. I think that's clear.
exactly. And
Jesus loves you. Yeah. Because there are
that's our
even
lens.
Yeah, that is our lens. It's like, is it loving? Is it of Jesus? Because there are different theories of atonement. There are different theories of all kinds of stuff that are acceptable within Orthodox Christianity that we can't. I'm like, I can't say, like, how can I say that to any particular person that you're wrong based on your interpretation of ancient texts in a totally different culture? And it boils down to me, the love of Jesus and the love of God. And if that's what's shining through and you're taking care of the vulnerable and you're not abusing people or lording power over people, I think that's where we want to sit. And that's where we want to sit in that tension of the rest of it. The rest of it, there is a tension around it. And we want clarity. We all do. Our brains want that so badly. And we need to really train ourselves to be able to sit with that tension with each other.
Right. All right. So if you could, and I want each of you to answer this question. If you could make
Okay.
one change to churches across, let's just say across the world, one change across the world to all churches, what change would that be?
Wow.
Who wants to take that one first?
Well, I'll go first because I have a very personal one, and that would be to believe survivors, because I was not believed, right? Or we believe you, but right. And I lost my church home of 18 years because I chose to be free, right? And so start by believing. And there's a lot that goes behind that. Like there's a lot of toxic teachings that need to be undone, and real discipleship on what it means to sit with the vulnerable and the hurting. But that would be my one thing: believe survivors.
And that's really beautiful. I know that I have been in situations where somebody says, yes, I believe you, but it looks like you're turning out all right. Looks like you're good. You got it.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
How about you?
that's not what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great, Jenni. This is a tough question. One thing is hard. I mean, I think that I would love to see that mindset shift within all leaders to say that, the church is not the institution. It's not the people. It is the individuals. It's the sheep. We're here to serve and protect the sheep. And that's the vulnerable. Sheep are really vulnerable. And so I think that, if we could make that would just be a huge shift in the way that we think, like our leaders, and so often think that they're there to, they've got to pay the electric bill, they've got to keep the lights on, they've got to manage all of the things. And, yes, that's a part of your job, but your main job is to shepherd the flock. And that's caring for the sheep and killing the wolves. Sorry, I don't mean to kill people. I don't mean I'm not advocating murder by any means. Please don't even think that. But keeping them safe from the wolves and the predators. That's what the shepherds do.
Yeah. I think my answer, I'm going to go ahead and answer.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I would love to
My
hear
answer
it.
would be very similar to yours, and that is let's shift the way we see leadership. Let's shift the way we see power and influence. Instead of being tied up in somebody's charisma or their ability to speak on a stage, let's turn it to the way that Jesus talked about leadership. If you want to be first, you have to be willing to be last. You have to serve people who are around you. And I think, like, we don't really think about leadership that way. We see it as somebody has these leadership qualities. That means they're confident. They always have the answer. And I feel like that is a big mistake. So,
yeah, I think we really need to get back to a leadership that's focused on character instead of on charisma.
yeah.
Right? Charisma can be a great addition, but if the character is not there, that has to be the foundation.
Right. Can you tell us a little bit about what you guys offer for victims? Because in case somebody who is watching this wants some help.
Yes. So we have a private Facebook group. So hopefully you do Facebook. We love Facebook. That is actually for any woman, because part of our thing is, yes, we want to support survivors, but we also want to change the narrative, right? And undo the myths. So if you want to learn how to better support survivors, and we do limit it to women, but you can find us Safer Coaching and Consulting Services. We have that free private group, and then every member of that group has a free consultation with us, with both of us or one of us, just to kind of see where they're at and what their needs are, and if we can set up with them. And if they're needing more than that, Laura, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so then we do, we do individual one-on-one coaching. We refer out to therapy or other types of resources, because we realize our limitations as well. Like you may need other types of services, but so we do one-on-one coaching and group coaching with people. We have a book study group that we're working on, and we are working, Jenni and I aren't making money on any of this. So we work really hard to keep our costs and our rates as low as we can in order to just kind of support some of the activity of the business that helps us be better at our jobs here, conferences and that sort of thing, that just kind of keeps us fresh and sharp. So yeah, we love to talk to people one-on-one. That free recovery strategy session that Jenni mentioned is a great way to just kind of get, have us as a sounding board, and we can give you some tips and some pointers as to what some next steps for you might be as you're working through your recovery process.
All right. If anyone is interested in seeing what they offer, I'm putting the links down below so that people can get connected and get help. We want you to all get help. I think that's what, our desire is. If you have been victimized, or if you know somebody who's been victimized, we want you to be able to get the help and resources that you need. Or if you're in charge of children or work with women, it might be very, very helpful for you to learn, how to see things from their perspective. So I think we've all experienced times where you got gaslit, even by women, because it's like,
Yes.
well, that's kind of like maybe even earlier generations, they just kind of assume abuse happens, financial abuse especially. So
Right. Yes.
Yeah,
For sure.
So I want to thank Jenni and Laura for coming on here and talking about such an important topic, and one that I think doesn't get talked about enough. If you have more interest in connecting with them, like I said, the links are below. And if you want to see more videos like this, be sure to like and subscribe. Have a beautiful day.